So, hello everyone, welcome to Bajirao IAS Academy. You all knew that we have been discussing the 2025 Gender Studies Mains answers. If you look at the Europe during the modern times, when medieval times, when Europe has been making a transition from the medieval times to the modern times, so there was a reformist or enlightenment movement that has been started. And this enlightened movement has influenced almost all sectors of the Europe's society. So therefore, these ideas have also influenced the French Revolution at that point of time, and that led to the overthrow of King 16. Right, so that has led to the overthrow of King 16, and then there is a rise of democratic principles, and that has also inspired the revolutions all across the world, because the French Revolution was essentially founded on the principles of liberty, equality and fraternity. Now let's understand the democracy and the power of people. Now if we talk about the democracy and the power of people, then before the French Revolution, so France was ruled by an absolute monarchy. Now whenever we talk about the absolute monarchy, he or she was not elected by the people, and in fact they take decisions on their own. People have no role in the decision making. However, the revolution has asserted that the sovereignty belongs to the people and not kings. Right? So the entire sovereignty belongs to the king, and people have no rights then before the French Revolution. However, in most of the countries, democratic societies or democratic governance has been established. And in fact, the entire world has been aspiring for the global democracy. So therefore, we can say that French Revolution has laid the foundation for citizens' rights to vote, protest and influence the government. Now the best example would be the Arab Spring. And if you know about the Arab Spring, in North African countries and Middle Eastern countries, there was no democracy. There was an absolute monarchy. However, people fought for their rights, and that led to overthrow of several existing regimes. So this Arab Spring was started in 2010 and continued up to 2012. And Arab Spring is associated with mass protests in the Middle East, and that has echoed the French demand for the representation and reform. So people have demanded that there should be a greater representation for the people, and there is a need for reforming the existing institutions so that people will have a large scale participation in those institutions. Right? So whenever you write an answer, it is always advised that you should also mention the relevant examples as well. And at that point of time, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizens, so it was made in the year 1789. And this declaration proclaimed that all men are born free and equal under the law. So there will be no discrimination among the people, irrespective, with respect to the caste, religion, race, place of birth, region. So there will be no discrimination. So all men are born free and they have equal rights, and there is no place for inequality or social injustice. But now the modern human rights, such as Universal Declaration of Human Rights that was made by the United Nations in the year 1948. So this Universal Declaration of Human Rights has been influenced by the Declaration of Rights of Man of Citizen. Right? And in fact, this was influenced by the French Revolution, and this has become the foundational document for the Universal Declaration of Human Rights made by the UN in the year 1948. Now the best example would be the LGBTQ plus community. And in fact, recently LGBTQ rights are in limelight, and in fact the societies have been recognizing the LGBTQ plus rights, social inequality and the gender justice movements. And in fact, all these essential aspects continue globally, and that has led to the, this is primarily because of the Enlightenment inspired ideas of liberty, equality and fraternity. Right? So the LGBTQ rights, racial inequality and the gender justice movements all across the world, even if you see in any part of the world, so they are primarily influenced by the French Revolution, and future movements would also be influenced by the French Revolution without a doubt. Now let's understand influence of this Enlightenment ideas. So at that point of time, there were philosophers like Voltaire, Rousseau, Montesquieu. So they actually influenced the revolutionaries to question the authority and demand freedom of thought. Because most of these philosophers or thinkers, they have advocated the values like liberty, equality, fraternity, justice, right? So they have also introduced thoughts like democracy. So therefore, they have imbibed the spirit of questioning the governments. However, now the critical thinking, secular education, tolerance, freedom of expression, so they are the pillars of the modern societies, right? So the best example would be the right to a free speech. For example, the Indian Constitution itself has recognized people's right to freedom of expression, freedom of speech, and free speech, and freedom of religion. For example, Indian Constitution Article 25 to Article 28 talks about freedom of religion of individuals. And in fact, freedom of religion, freedom of free press, so they become the cornerstone of individual fundamental rights in any democratic institutions worldwide. And in fact, the freedoms or the civil liberties that the modern societies have been providing to its citizens are influenced by the French Revolution. So this could be another example. And apart from that, you should also talk about the social justice and the class equality that people have been going through. Now, in fact, the revolution has triggered or targeted the privileges of the nobility, particularly the feudal class and the clergy. So therefore, they have been advocating for a classless society, right? So classless, casteless society is very important to achieve the values of equality, social justice, and class equality. However, French Revolution has essentially targeted the privileges enjoyed by the nobility or the feudal class and the clergy, and they have advocated for the classless society. And now movements against the economic inequality, racism, social discrimination, so they draw revolutionary calls for the fairness. Now the best example would be the Occupy Wall Street movement in the year 2011. And in fact, that has used slogans like "We are 99%," and that has echoed the principles of French Revolution against the elite power at that point of time in US, right? So anyway, government has used repression against these protesters, and government has also came in support of the elite class at that point of time. Next, we need to talk about the nationalism and modern nation state. And modern nation state as an idea has came forward from this reformist movement. The ideas of nationalism also inspired from the Enlightenment movement at that point of time. And in fact, the French Revolution has further cemented the ideas of nationalism and the modern nation state, because the French Revolution has helped shape the idea of nation defined by its people, not its monarch, because monarch is not directly elected by the people. He controls all the powers and he will have all the sovereignty with him. But democracy as a concept which advocates for the rights of the people. And in fact, in the modern nation states as well, so they actually base their legitimacy from the people. And in fact, the authority that the government enjoys in the modern days will get from the people. And the constitutions and elections as the cornerstones of the modern nation states and nationalism. So for example, the spread of national independence movements in the 19th and 20th centuries, for example, India, Vietnam. So they can trace back to the roots of the French revolutionary spirit. So therefore, across the dimensions, French Revolution has inspired many aspects of the contemporary world. And in future also, the French Revolution will continue to inspire several such domains, particularly the civil liberties of the people and the powers of the government, social justice, equality and egalitarian societies. So this is how you have to write the answer, and you need to mention examples in almost every point. And in the conclusion of this answer, so you need to talk about the French Revolution in a positive and optimistic way. So we all knew that the French Revolution has changed the entire world history. So you can call it as a global turning point. And in fact, the French Revolution's core principles, including liberty, equality, and fraternity, they continue to inspire the political movements, human rights advocacy, and demands for the justice today. Whether through mass protests, democratic reforms in every society, and global human rights efforts, the legacy of 1789 endures in the heartbeat of the modern society. So in this way, the French Revolution has inspired the modern societies and the movements in the modern societies based on or centered around the values of liberty, equality, justice, and fraternity. Right? So I hope you have understood this question. And the next question is about geography. Right? So you all knew that in Gender Studies Paper 1, geography is also a very, very important subject. And in fact, more than 40% of questions are actually asked from the geography topic. So therefore, it is very, very important that you should adequately focus on this particular topic as well. Right? So the question says that give geographical explanation of distribution of offshore oil reserves of the world. How are they different from onshore occurrences of oil reserves? Now first understand the offshore oil reserves and onshore oil reserves. And in fact, India is a country which needed energy security. So we need to ensure energy security for our populations. So in order to achieve energy security, what we have to do? We have been dependent on the crude oil from other countries. So around 85% of our crude oil demands are met through imports. And similarly, we also have the offshore oil reserves and onshore oil reserves as well. So offshore oil reserves are those oil reserves which are located within the ocean or sea. However, the onshore oil reserves are those oil reserves which are located near the coast, but they are not located in the oceans or sea. Now we need to give a geographical explanation of the distribution of offshore oil reserves and onshore oil reserves of the world. So remember that the world geography is also part of the geography syllabus. They will also ask about the mineral resources which are distributed across the world. So therefore, this question is asked from the mineral resources which are distributed all across the world. So therefore, you have to read about the mineral resources which are distributed in several parts of the world. However, they are different from the onshore occurrences of oil reserves. Now, how the offshore oil reserves are different from the onshore oil reserves? So you have to have two parts in this question. So first part, you have to give geographical explanation of the distribution of offshore oil reserves, and in the second part, you have to give an account on how offshore oil reserves are different from the onshore oil reserves. Right? So the model framework of this question, in the introduction, you should briefly talk about the oil reserves which exist onshore and offshore. And then in the body part of the answer, you need to talk about the offshore reserves are found in Gulf of Mexico, North Sea, and West Africa. And they also require advanced technology or costlier than the onshore reserves. So therefore, you have to explain two parts in the body part of the answer. Now, in the conclusion, you just mentioned there are several challenges for the exploration of oil in the offshore, but offshore oil remains vital for global energy needs alongside the onshore sources as well. Right? So first of all, you need to have a model framework for every answer. So once you have a model framework, you can write the answer accordingly. So I hope you have understood this. Now first, understand the introduction of offshore versus onshore oil reserves. Right, so it is very important for us to understand the difference between offshore and onshore oil reserves. So you can see on this image, this is onshore oil reserve and this is offshore oil reserve. Offshore oil reserve is located within the sea or the ocean. However, the onshore oil reserves are located on the earth or near the coastline. And in fact, the onshore oil reserves are located beneath the land surfaces, and they are often the sedimentary basins. And in fact, you can also see this here, right? So they are just located beneath the land surfaces and often in sedimentary basins. And offshore oil reserves, if we talk about the offshore oil reserves, they found beneath the seabed, typically in shallow or deep waters or continental shelves or oceanic basins. And in fact, both onshore and offshore oil reserves, so they are crucial for meeting the global energy needs or the global energy security. However, if we talk about the location of onshore and offshore oil reserves, extraction methods and economic importance, so it actually differs greatly, right? So we'll be understanding the extraction methods, their location, the economic importance in the body part of the answer, but you have to understand that both onshore and offshore oil reserves are very, very important for the extraction, right? So if we talk about the offshore oil reserves, so they found beneath the seabed, and onshore oil reserves, they located beneath land surfaces, right? So this is how you have to introduce this answer. And in this question, it is always advised that you draw a world map and you need to show all these areas, right? So you need to draw a world map and you should show the offshore and onshore oil reserves. So let's understand the geographical distribution of both offshore oil reserves and onshore oil reserves. Firstly, we'll be dealing with offshore oil reserves. Now, offshore reserves are spread across the major ocean seas, particularly the continental margins, right? So in fact, we have several continents, So in fact, the offshore oil reserves are located across the continental margins. Now, the first one is the North Sea, where there is an offshore oil reserve. And in fact, in the North Sea, the offshore oil reserves are located across different countries, including UK, Norway, and Denmark. And the examples of major offshore oil reserves including Brent, Ekofisk, and Statfjord, right? So if we talk about the importance of offshore oil reserves, one of the first major offshore drilling regions, and they are contributing significantly to European oil production. Remember that oil is very important for energy security of the entire world. So therefore, they are being called as the first major offshore drilling regions in the North Sea. And also remember that the offshore oil reserves are located across the continental margins. So they contribute significantly to European oil production and energy security. And secondly, you have Gulf of Mexico. And this is also located across the continental margins. And in the Gulf of Mexico, countries like United States and Mexico, they are producing oil. And in fact, the major companies including Shell, BP, and Chevron. So these countries have been extracting oil from the offshore oil reserves, which are located across the Gulf of Mexico. And the features of it including the deep water oil drilling with some of the most advanced rigs in the world, right? So North Sea in Europe, the major offshore oil fields, oil reserves, Gulf of Mexico, and then the West Africa in Atlantic margin. Now in West Africa, there are countries which have the offshore oil reserves, the countries including Nigeria, Angola, Ghana, and the Equatorial Guinea. There are some rich offshore basins including Niger Delta and Konja Basin. And if we talk about the Africa's offshore production, it is expanding to deep water discoveries as well, because now the world is looking to ensure global energy security. There are a number of countries which are desperately waiting for the oil reserves in countries like Africa. So therefore, now the African countries have been expanding themselves to the deep water discoveries of the oil. So therefore, another major offshore oil reserves region is Persian Gulf in the Middle East. And in fact, if we talk about the Persian Gulf, there are countries like Iran, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Qatar, right? So these are the main countries in the Middle East. Even though known onshore fields, countries like Qatar, UAE have the large offshore reserves. And in fact, they are also home to fields like Jakum in UAE, North Dome, South Pars shared by Qatar and Iran. So therefore, these are the major offshore oil reserves in the Persian Gulf in Middle East. And in fact, South China Sea is also a region which has the offshore oil reserves. So there are countries like China, Vietnam, Malaysia and Philippines. They hold the offshore oil reserves. However, the unique aspect of the South China Sea offshore oil fields or oil reserves is that the tensions exist over the territorial claims, because Philippines, there are some other countries like Vietnam, Indonesia, so those countries have the territorial claims within the South China Sea due to potential oil and gas reserves. And in fact, thus in South China Sea, it is also known for shallow water and ultra deep water reserves. And another major offshore oil reserves region is Brazil in South Atlantic Ocean. Pre-salt reserves of the coast of Brazil such as Lula and Tupi fields. Extraction from deep beneath salt layers on seabed, and technologically challenging, but it is a lucrative option to extract oil. And next, so how our offshore reserves are different from the onshore oil reserves? So let's understand the difference between two. And in fact, the onshore and offshore oil reserves, because as part of the question it is being asked, first you have to identify geographically the location of the offshore oil reserves, then you have to differentiate how onshore oil reserves are different from the offshore oil reserves. Now in fact, the onshore oil reserves are located beneath the land, and very often they are sedimentary in nature. For example, the onshore oil reserves, they may locate beneath deserts, forests and the plain areas as well. However, in terms of access, they are easily available, they could be easily accessible. However, if we talk about the offshore oil reserves, they are located beneath oceans, seas, continental shelves. And in fact, the offshore oil reserves, they're very often difficult and often remote based, and they are also located deep beneath the seabed. Right? So access is not easy with respect to the offshore oil reserves, and this could be the major difference between onshore and offshore oil reserves. Now the best example would be the Gawa field in Saudi Arabia, which is known as the world's largest onshore oil reserve. However, in Brazil there is another offshore oil field which is Lula field in Brazil. Right? So you have to mention the examples as well along with the points, and it would be better if you represent this as a table and write the differences. And then if we talk about the extraction technology of offshore oil reserve and onshore oil reserve, the onshore oil reserve very often use land rigs, and in fact it is very often cheaper in setting up. Right? So rigging or even extracting the oil in onshore oil fields, it is very often easy. However, if we talk about the offshore extraction, so it requires the complex platforms, subsea drilling systems and ROVs. So therefore it is more expensive and too risky as well. Right? So therefore we can say that the onshore oil reserves extraction of oil is much easier, the setup is much easy, and it just uses the land rigs. But offshore oil rigging is very complex. Right? So it is more expensive and it is more risky as well. For example, the offshore rigs like Perdido platform in Gulf of Mexico, so it operates in ultra deep water of around 2450 feet. So therefore it would be more expensive, and also more risk has been involved in extraction of the oil from the offshore oil fields. Now let's understand the cost and investment about this. So if we talk about the cost and investment in onshore oil reserves, so it has a lower operational cost and it gives quicker returns to us. But with respect to offshore oil fields or oil reserves, high setup and high maintenance cost, high initial investment, but often high volume output. The example would be the pre-salt offshore fields in Brazil. The pre-salt offshore fields in Brazil, they actually require billions in investment, but they offer a huge return. So that is the best advantage. So even if it is more expensive, more risky, it requires more investment, they actually offer huge returns, not like onshore oil reserves. And maintenance cost is also very high with respect to the offshore oil reserves, and you need to make a higher initial investment, but often high volume output can also be received from the offshore oil fields which are located deep inside the sea. And if we talk about the environmental risk that is involved in both onshore and offshore extraction of the oil from these fields, onshore oil fields, it will be easier spill containment, right? So, and apart from that, easier logistics is also another major advantage. However, with respect to offshore oil fields, so oil spill can devastate marine ecosystems, and it is also hard to monitor and clean up the spills as well, right? So the best example would be Deepwater Horizon spill 2010, right? So this is located in Gulf of Mexico, and this caused the worst marine oil disaster in the history, right? So therefore the offshore oil spills, so they can actually have a devastating effect on the marine ecosystem, and it will be hard to monitor and also clean up the oil spills, right? So by this we can come to the conclusion that the offshore oil fields, they can have a huge destructive effect on the marine ecosystem. So initial investment is too high, maintenance cost is too high, extraction of oil is also not easy, oil spills also easily takes place. But despite that, they actually produce a huge volumes of oil. A huge volume of oil is extracted from the offshore oil reserves, and they can also give a huge returns for the countries as well. And thereby the offshore oil fields, despite a lot of challenges, they can actually ensure, or they are actually helpful for the global energy security, right? So I hope you have understood this. Now next important question: how can artificial intelligence and drones be effectively used along with GIS and RS techniques in locational and aerial planning? And understand that this is also an important question that has been asked from the geography portion, right? So here you have to answer how AI and drones be effectively used for GIS and RS techniques in locational and aerial planning. Now let's understand the model framework for this question. First, you have to write the introduction. Now in the introduction, so you need to mention about the locational planning and where to place things, and aerial planning, how to use lands. And then you need to mention the key tools in the second part of the answer, such as GIS and RS, drones and artificial intelligence and their applications and the benefits, and you should conclude the answer. Now whenever you are writing an answer, it is very important that you should have a proper structure. You should have a model framework for this answer so that the answer would be best. Now let's understand the question from the introduction: artificial intelligence, drones, GIS and RS techniques. So in fact, if we talk about all these techniques, it is being said that these techniques have transformed the locational and aerial planning in different regions across the world. Because the advantage with the technology based techniques is that they're more precise and they are also data driven systems. So that means they will allow planners to collect real-time data, and they analyze the spatial patterns, and they could also make better, faster decisions. And there are projects like Swamitva. So I hope everybody knew about this project called Swamitva, right? So Swamitva project has mapped around 6.62 lakh villages so far, and it has also demonstrated the power of these technologies in improving the land management and land planning, right? So here we should understand the AI and drones in locational planning. So let's understand this very briefly. And if we talk about the artificial intelligence powered drones, Their application is that they could actually select the site, and they could also do the analysis of the existing terrain, and in fact they are more accurate. And the coverage of artificial intelligence based drones is around 10,000 square kilometers per week. And in fact, if you look at the key uses of AI based or AI powered drones: automated site selection, real-time adjustment for the projects, right? So apart from that, if we talk about the machine learning, so machine learning is also another technology, and that has been used for the locational and aerial planning and analysis of the existing data. And in fact, their applications including the land suitability, planning, zoning and mapping. And in fact, machine learning actually has 95% of accuracy when it comes to doing its job. And in fact, it has the state level coverage, so it can cover the entire state as well. And the important functions that it can perform including the predictive modeling, risk assessment of a particular region, urban growth projections as well. And next important technology is computer vision. Now, the applications of computer vision including infrastructure and asset monitoring in a particular area. And in fact, the computer vision can actually provide real-time updates on number of areas, and it can also provide city-wide surveillance as well. And in fact, it will be helpful in infrastructure optimization, hazard mapping and quick decision making in an area, right? So these are the AI and drones and their applications in the locational planning, right? So let's understand the AI and drones in aerial planning in detail. So what exactly they can do with the examples. So firstly, the land use classification. And in fact, in Maharashtra, there is AI based crop mapping. And this AI based crop mapping has actually achieved 92% accuracy across 3.07 lakh hectares. So therefore, this accurate assessment helped in improving the cropping pattern and its optimization and providing the precision farming techniques. And in fact, we should understand the importance of technology in the agriculture sector to improve the farm incomes and also practice sustainable agriculture that could adapt the climate change and its first impact. Next, we need to talk about the urban growth modeling. Now, if we talk about the urban growth modeling, Bengaluru's artificial intelligence based GIS system, this predicts the urban sprawl with 85% precision, and that has enabled proactive zoning and sustainable urban design in Bengaluru. And apart from that, resource distribution is also another very important domain where artificial intelligence and drones will have a key role to play, because the automated analysis helps the governments to identify the underserved areas, so thereby ensuring that there will be an equitable allocation of the public service and utilities, and also the equitable development of those backward regions as well. And another aspect is environmental impact monitoring, because drones regularly track the changes in the vegetation cover, water quality and air pollution. So therefore, they also have important applications with respect to the environmental impact monitoring over a particular area because of the existing industries, urbanization or any other causes. And disaster management is also another very important domain where AI drones have a huge benefit or advantages. And recently, Uttarakhand has integrated drones to the GIS to monitor 13,000 square kilometers of landslide prone zones. So we all knew that the Himalayan belt and the Western Ghats are vulnerable to the landslides. So what Uttarakhand has done, Uttarakhand has integrates drones and GIS to monitor around 13,000 square kilometers of an area which is landslide prone. Now, if you regularly monitor the landslide prone areas, they can actually provide you the early warning systems, and they can also provide efficient relief planning. And apart from that, the biodiversity planning is also another very important area. right? Because biodiversity has also been facing new threats in recent days. So therefore, high resolution imagery, AI based analytics, so they will identify the habitat loss, and they will also monitor the wildlife corridors for the conservation strategies, right? So this is how AI and drones actually help in the planning of a particular region. Now let's understand some implementation examples as well. We all knew that in the year 2015, Union government has launched the Smart Cities mission. Surat, which is one of the smart city, it uses the AI drone integration for traffic management and urban design. Secondly, agricultural planning is also another very important area, where Punjab Soil Health Mapping Project covers 5.03 million hectares of land. And forest management, in fact, when it comes to the forest management, Odisha uses AI powered systems to track 37% of its total forest cover for the conservation. Remember that artificial intelligence and drones have important applications with respect to the environmental impact monitoring and assessment, and also the biodiversity protection as well. So therefore, Odisha is an area where there's a huge forest cover. So therefore, they have used the AI powered systems to track 37% of its total forest cover for conservation. And apart from that, we should also talk about the mining surveillance. So with respect to mining surveillance, Chhattisgarh actually employs drones and AI to monitor and curb illegal mining. Excuse me. Right, so you can also mention some implementation examples in the answer before finally concluding this. So therefore, ultimately integrating artificial intelligence, drones and GIS RS, so they can actually create a comprehensive ecosystem for spatial planning. They ensure accuracy, efficiency and the sustainability as well. And in fact, it will be backed by policies like National Geospatial Policy that was launched in the year 2022, and initiatives under the Digital India Mission. So therefore, these technologies that we have just talked about, they redefine how locational and aerial planning drive smarter, resilient and sustainable development across the different sectors. So this is how you have to conclude this answer. And that's all in this lecture, and thank you so much, and please subscribe our YouTube channel and also hit the like button. Thank you.